All right. Now we're going to talk a little bit about one of the most famous and really infamous studies in all of social psychology and maybe even all of psychology. First, I want to set the stage a little bit and take us back to some of the distinctions I made earlier between social influence and some of the types of social influence. And remember, obedience in a lot of ways is kind of a specific type of compliance where there's a specific command that's coming from somebody who has a high status position for whatever reason in a hierarchy, and they are making a demand of somebody else or commanding them to do something because of that authority. And obedience oftentimes is a good thing for organizations, that people at the top are able to make decisions and the people below them in whatever hierarchy are able to or are expected to and then do follow their orders. But obedience can also have a very dark side, obviously, because it can blind people to making decisions of their own. And let's face it, people in positions of power are not always, and frankly, not even often more qualified to make decisions than the people they are ordering around. In history, there are literally countless tragic examples of obedience leading to loss of life or dehumanization of people. A couple examples that come to mind: the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, when American troops killed hundreds of women and children in a village in Vietnam in the Vietnam War. With very little compunction. They got an order to kill people in the town, and they ran with it and did so. Another more recent example, events at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq after the invasion in 2003. Prisoners were dehumanized in a number of ways. They were made to strip naked, pose for photographs, had cold water dumped on them, all sorts of different things to belittle and dehumanize them at the orders of people higher up in positions of power. Outside of military examples, obedience also comes into play frequently in different religious movements and cults. They often have a very hierarchical nature, and most of the time, the obedience within a religious group or cult takes the form of, someone taking relatively benign orders. But sometimes, especially when there is intense devotion in those groups, they can result in loss of life too. With the mass suicides in Jonestown, the colloquial, drinking of the Kool-Aid saying comes from that mass suicide where people drink Kool-Aid laced with cyanide, and the Heaven's Gate mass suicide having, I can't remember what chemical it was, but a very similar outcome there. So people, listen to people in positions of power, especially when their power, comes from something we take as legitimate, like military authority or divine in the case of a spiritual leader. Of course, the kind of hallmark example of obedience in history and in social psychology for people following orders that, they should not have followed, or the world would be better off had they not followed, is the Holocaust and the forced extermination of millions of Jews, Roma, people with dark skin, and homosexuals in the Holocaust. I assume people are at least somewhat familiar with that, so I don't need to go into details, but the murders at the hands of the German military in the Holocaust are much of the reason that lots of social psychologists in the 1950s and 60s were interested in studying racism and anti-Semitism and authoritarianism, intergroup relations, and also things like conformity and obedience. People were very interested in trying to figure out how people could follow orders that would lead to the killing of other human beings. So the main question, or one of the main questions that comes from this, why do people obey authority figures when they're asked to do something, normally unthinkable or despicable like this? How can people murder other innocent human beings, or torture them, or take their own lives if they know that's wrong, and they know it's an unacceptable thing to do? Why do people obey authority figures under those situations, or in those circumstances? And this brings us back to kind of that classic disposition or situational explanation thing. It can be very attractive or tempting to think, well, the people that carry out those types of behaviors are people that have some kind of character flaw. The people that were helping with exterminations in the Holocaust, or killing innocent people in the Vietnam War, there was something wrong with them, and they were like an evil person in some way. And by and large, that seems to not really be that good of an explanation for this. Most of the people that were enlisted in the Vietnam War were, average, everyday human beings that just found themselves in a situation where they took something too far, or followed an order that they shouldn't. And you can make an argument that a lot of the German soldiers might have been doing the same thing. It doesn't excuse their behavior, obviously, but it's kind of short-sighted and not very accurate to say that there's something uniquely evil about all of those people. It might be that, again, kind of like with the last section, how we ended up, it's that situations are the bad things that might be leading people to engage in very bad behavior. So something that seems a little bit more likely is that we should look into what about situations might promote something akin to violence or torture. So this brings us to what I mentioned, one of the more famous studies in all of social psychology, Stanley Milgram's obedience studies that he conducted at Yale in the 1960s and early 70s. So if you're not familiar with this, I'm going to describe it a little bit, and there's actually a pretty good, it's a fictional movie, it's a, dramatization called Experimenter, that's about all the events around these studies. It obviously takes some liberties, but it's a pretty good account, and has, some good performances in it and stuff. So if you have some time to kill, which I think a lot of people might at this point, you might want to check that out. It has a delightful turn where Jim Gaffigan is popping up as someone that's involved in the study for not really any reason, but I guess he is kind of a real actor now. Anyway, so Milgram's obedience study. This, again, like a lot of the social science in the middle of the last century, was trying to figure out how people could follow orders that were leading to terrible ends, like in the Holocaust. And Milgram wanted to know how people could follow orders that would lead to the harm of another person. So they took an ad out, they looked for participants, and for at least the first studies, they did many, many iterations of this with different people from different walks of life, but they were just looking for any men in the area around New Haven, Connecticut, where Yale is, between the ages of 25 and 50. And they just recruited them, telling them it was about a study of memory, about teaching and learning. So they offered people $4, which, is more now than it was, or more in the 1960s than it is now, but still not like that big of an amount of money, maybe akin to like $20 now. Offered them, nominal compensation to come and be involved in a study of memory. Then the experimenter, wearing a very official-looking lab coat somewhere on the Yale campus, brought the real participant and a fake participant into the lab. This is another one of those studies where they're using a Confederate who's posing as a participant to kind of trick the real person into thinking there's more normal people involved than not. So they bring them into the lab, they're sitting in a couple chairs, and the experimenter gives them kind of a random selection, or random assignment rather, to make one of them the teacher and one of them the learner. He, balls up something or some papers that say teacher and learner in his hands, and he has them pick, and they have it set up so the Confederate, the fake participant, is always assigned to be the learner, and the real participant is always assigned to be the teacher. The role of the teacher is to teach and test the learner on some word associations. So they are trying to do this with different forms of rewards and punishments, and this is supposedly a punishment trial. And the punishments they're using are electrical shocks. So they bring the learner into this room, get them set up and rigged up to be electrically shocked when they miss things, and the participant actually is told that they need to get a shock so they know what it's like, and they get a 45-volt shock, which it hurts, but it's not going to leave any lasting damage or anything or be overly painful, but it shows them at least that they are doing something that hurts when they give shocks to another person. The learner also mentions during this time where they're getting set up that they have a heart condition. Obviously it's fake, they're making this up, but they mention it just offhand to the experimenter, saying like, hey, just so you know, maybe I should mention this, and the experimenter says it shouldn't be a problem. After this, the teacher goes back into the other room, and they are set up in front of this big apparatus that is where they shock the learner with their punishments. But basically what they're doing is they're teaching all these really random seeming word associations to the learner. It's things like pen, horse, and they have to remember that pen is associated with horse. And then later on they have these recall trials where they'll say pen, can, horse, desk, door, answer. And the learner then is supposed to say horse, because pen was associated with horse before. So they're really random, they're pretty hard, they're not like systematically related in any, conceptual way, like grass and green or something. And after a little bit, the learner starts to make mistakes, and that's where the punishments come in. So for every mistake that the learner makes, they are given an increasingly high voltage electrical shock, supposedly. The learner is not really part of this. They are a Confederate. They're not really getting shocked. But the learner, by all accounts, all seem to believe, at least to a certain degree, that they were actually doing this to the other person. So it starts out at 15, they're at a slight shock here, and you can see it goes up and up and up. This is kind of a recreation of what this apparatus looked like. This original thing, actually, by the way, is in the Smithsonian Museum now. But it goes up and up and up, slight shock, moderate shock, strong, very strong, intense, extreme intensity shock, dangerous, severe shock, and then up by the top level at the 29th and 30th mistakes, 435 and 450 volts at the end, and it's just ominously labeled with this triple X logo, meaning, extraordinary danger or something like that. I'm not going to play this video right now just because if you want, it's in the slides, or you can find different videos on YouTube. I'd recommend taking a look. It's pretty interesting to see these recordings. They are recordings of the real learners, and as they're going through this and they're shocking this person, they, do seem genuinely conflicted. They're having some anguish over this, and they're really kind of struck with what to do as they go through. So again, I'd recommend you take a look at this through the slide file, or find some videos yourself on YouTube. So before they actually carried out this study, they asked students at Yale and psychiatrists what they thought would actually happen. Like, how many people would actually go all the way to the end and give people those shocks all the way up to 450 volts, those XXX shocks. Students said they thought, anywhere between nobody and 3% of people would go all the way to the end and administer those shocks. And psychiatrists estimated on average that maybe 0.1% of people would go all the way to the end. And this was, kind of in line with what Milgram thought too. The initial plan for these studies were that they would conduct them in the United States and get kind of a baseline idea of how obedient people would be on these studies, and then to do it in other places. Specifically, they wanted to carry them out in Germany to see if there were higher rates of obedience there. And that was kind of tying into their interests in, does this have something to do with the actions in the Holocaust and in World War II and the German army. So everybody kind of thought that this would, that nobody would go all the way to the end. But lo and behold, as they actually went through this, they found when they got up to the slight shock range, nobody quit. Nobody dropped out. That's what the 0 means here, that nobody's maximum shock was in this low range. And around this point, up to 75 volts, or at 75 volts, the learner then gave kind of a grunt when they missed the shock, or when they got the shock. And nobody dropped out at this point. Once they got up to 120, the learner yelled out and said something along the lines of, "Hey, that really hurts." And nobody dropped out at that point. Then they get all the way up to 180. The learner yelled out, "I can't stand the pain, don't do that." Nobody stopped at this point. Up a little bit higher, around 195, through the very strong shock range, they reminded everyone that they had a heart condition and that they were concerned about it because of the pain and the stress they were going through. Nobody dropped out. Up to intense shock through the 300 volt range, a few people started dropping out of the 40-person sample at this point. Around 285, the learner let out an agonized scream with no words, just screaming at that point. And so that was, probably related to a few people dropping out there. At 315 volts, the learner then said that they were refusing to answer any more questions if they were still going to get shocked, saying, I'm not going to do this anymore, I refuse, I'm not playing this game, etc., through this extreme intensity shock, and some people stopped there. But after the 350 volt spot, they really did stop answering. There were no answers. The person was totally unresponsive, just giving an ominous silence back to the teacher. So all they're getting in response is silence. And the experimenter at this point tells the person who's saying, "What do I do? Keep going?" They say, "The experiment requires that you continue." These are the types of things they've been saying to the person all throughout this. This authority figure is sitting there the whole time saying things like, "The experiment requires you go on." And the person's saying things like, or the teacher saying things like, "Who's responsible for this?" And the experimenter will say something like, "I'm responsible." And they're just kind of saying 4 or 5 different things that are prodding them to keep going, basically, the whole time. So, at this point, no response, completely unresponsive. Even up through the 420 volt range that says danger severe shock, only one more person dropped out. So, all the way to the end, past the 450 volt range, 26 of those 40 people went all the way to the end, delivering what they had every reason to believe were fatal shocks to a totally unresponsive person, or at least inflicting some kind of severe damage to this person. So the actual results of this, almost 2/3 of people, are a far cry from what students and psychiatrists and Milgram and his colleagues thought at the time. In fact, Milgram is quoted in some sources as saying here that there's no reason for us to take the study to Germany, that they've uncovered something dark about humanity here, and they have more to study no matter where they are, basically. It's important to remember, too, like I said, go ahead and watch those videos through the slides. I just don't want to make these videos longer than they need to be. But all the people were expressing serious reservations about this. They're very, very hesitant. They're experiencing turmoil. It takes them a long time to go through. They don't want to do it. And the research are just saying things like, the experiment requires you continue, is enough to make people keep doing it, basically. But it's important to think, too, about the different types of conditions that they put people through. There were other versions of this study where they changed things about the situation. Because remember, this is a very specific, contrived type of situation. It's obviously very troubling that people went all the way through this, but it's not inevitable that people are going to do this. If you have different conditions, different situational factors, it changes it a bit. And most of all, it seems that it just depended on how people construed or understood the situation. If they thought about it in a different way because of these different situational factors, then it changed things quite a bit. So if people thought they had more freedom or choice for some reason, or if they empathized with the learner, or if they had some reason to doubt the authority of the experimenter, they were less likely to go all the way to the end. So let me show you some examples of what I mean by that. Some of these different situational variables reported in kind of a summary study or summary article of this study later on. If you look at the original baseline for men, the original study, 65%, there's actually no difference in women. Women went all the way to the end at about 2/3 of people as well. And you can compare this to people getting no commands at all from the researcher, and very few people at all did this. So obviously there's something about the commands and the authority that people are perceiving that is really driving them to go all the way to the end. If they're not getting prodded by the researcher, then pretty much nobody does it. Some of the other things that make you kind of wonder if the authority is really something making them do this. They tried a different location in downtown Hartford, Connecticut, not on the official place where they were doing it at the Yale campus in a venerated science lab type of area. If they did it in some random office downtown, then it dropped a bit. People were less likely to do it when it was a less prestigious place. Or when they had somebody that was presenting themselves as kind of an ordinary person, just in regular clothing, not in a lab coat, basically, then it dropped off considerably. If it didn't seem quite as official with somebody, you saw this enormous drop down to about 1 in 5 people that were doing this. And the proximity that people had to the authority figure also seemed to matter. If the experimenter was giving people cues through an intercom rather than in the exact same room, then it dropped again down to about 1 in 5 people rather than 2 in 3 people, like with the baseline. A couple of things that had to do with empathy. The learner in that original experiment, remember, is in a different room. The teacher and learner can't see each other, so they're separated there. But if the learner was in the same room and people had to kind of see them acting this stuff out, then it dropped a bit, down to about 2 in 5 people. It dropped a bit more if the participant was required to touch the learner while this was going on. I still don't really understand, honestly, after years and years of reading about this, how they convince people that, you can touch them and they'll get electrically shocked, but you won't get shocked. I don't know. But people believed it. And it seems to be the case that helped a little bit more in reducing the obedience, that having to touch that person and really probably think more about what they're experiencing had the baseline level drop quite a bit. But the biggest drop is something we've kind of already talked about. Remember back to the Solomon-Asch line studies where people are conforming to those incorrect judgments about the line lengths. And if you had even one person there disobeying, then conformity dropped, and you had people answering 95% of those questions right again, rather than only maybe 65%. In this study, they had other Confederates in some circumstances where other people were saying no, they weren't going to do it. So if other people disobeyed, even when the experimenter was there giving them commands, it drops almost as far down as when there are no commands at all. So if other people are disobeying, that kind of gives people license in their minds. It seems to, break those rules once they see other people breaking them and changing the norm. So lots of things here that might change the rate of obedience. Who else didn't obey? If we think about demographic types of indicators, It's interesting to note that political party did not make a difference. Whether people were Democrats or Republicans, they did this at about the same rates, not a significant difference there. Religion did seem to matter, but only in the sense that Catholics seemed to be a little bit more likely to obey than Protestant or Jewish participants. And this seems to be probably because Catholics are in a religious tradition that's a little more hierarchical and rule-based, so they might be people or from a tradition that values obedience a little bit more than Protestant or Jewish participants. Obviously, it's a generalization, and they only had, sufficient numbers of people from a few religious groups to say anything about it, but it was something that was noted in these original papers. One big thing that did seem to decrease obedience was education. The more educated people were, the less obedient they were, which, does make some sense that people with more education tend to be higher up in hierarchies frequently, and more egalitarian as well. So more education being, less used to following orders perhaps, or at least having more enlightened, well, I don't want to say enlightened, but egalitarian ideas about people seems to have decreased obedience pretty significantly. They also made this kind of arbitrary distinction for different types of professions. Milgram called moral professions things like medicine, law, and education, having to do with, people and philosophy and, kind of broad senses. People in those professions were less likely to obey than people in more technical or maybe stereotypically colder fields like engineering or something. I think, this seems like maybe they were kind of looking for differences rather than having good hypotheses about them. So I don't know if I'd put too much stock into this finding, but it was something they reported at least. But it does seem that, at least in some sense, education and values seem to play some kind of role here, even when political party did not, and religion didn't seem to matter that much either. I should note that religiosity, like the intense, how intense you are devoted to this religion as they measured it, or like church attendance and things like that, didn't really seem to matter. It was just the type of religious tradition. People have often talked about in the years after this study if it would replicate, and I think it's important to note how central the Milgram studies were to changing the way we treat human subjects. So there were a lot of things in the early and middle parts of the last century that led us to realize that people that are in medical and social science studies need to be treated with respect, obviously, and need to be protected, and researchers can't just do whatever they want to them. There were a lot more serious things and things that, very clearly violated people's human rights and harmed them that led to these changes. But it would be a lie to say that the Milgram study was not one of those things at all, or that it wasn't at least one of the things that led people to think about this. So, again, the people that were involved in this were really distraught. Some of them credited it later as changing their lives or affecting them forever. So it was something that made researchers and lawmakers understand that we needed to be a little more respectful of participants. And as a result, we've long wondered, does the Milgram study replicate? And since no one could do it because it is an unethical study, we didn't really have an answer to that question. We have slightly better answers now, though. More recently, people have started to do kind of simulations of the Milgram study where you do a little more pre-screening to make sure that you're not, or to try to make sure that you're not going to recruit people that might be particularly emotionally distressed by this experience of thinking that you're harming someone in this way. And they note that across all these different studies that most people, if they got to the 150 volt mark, they're going to go all the way to 450. So they just tried to replicate the results of, okay, do we get the same proportions of people going up to 150 volts? So it only goes up that high, and the study is stopped. So because they took more care in screening and debriefing the participants in a more responsible way, and they changed some of the circumstances around this, some replications of this have been done. And when you do this, you find the same rates of obedience that Milgram found in his original studies in the 60s and 70s. So really, not the most encouraging thing to find that this doesn't seem to be an anomaly, that other researchers are able to find the same thing, but it is very informative. It does seem that these things are reliable effects. There are more recent replications too. You've read about one of them for the reading for this section. And rather than doing a top hat question, I'm going to have you go to Canvas and find the new section about like top hat replacement questions, and do the question about the Dolinsky et al. Study. That one's about a version of this replication that was conducted in Poland. So go ahead and head over and do that after this video. And in the next one, we will move on to talking about social norms.